Negotiations, it's always a give and take, and yes, it's true. I think the South African poultry industry, they did give in this instance. The alternative was, we keep these trade barriers, we keep these anti-dumping duties, but we risk losing preferences for the whole agricultural industry, which would have been a much bigger blow to South Africa.
Right then, let's expand this conversation. Daniel Rangers is joining us live in Washington, D.C. Angela Kubler is in Johannesburg as well. Angela, let's start with you. Now that US imports have finally started to come in, have the local poultry farmers resigned themselves to this being the new norm, or are they looking for fresh and different protection from the state?
Well, bottom line here is the poultry industry agreed to that importation of that 65,000 tonnes. It was their agreement, and essentially they did take one for the local AGOA team. In context though, South Africa imported around 450,000 tonnes of poultry last year, so this amount is really very small. The actual import period, by the way, starts on the 1st of April. This phase that we've just gone through was kind of a test run. At this stage though, Raman, the poultry farmers don't really know what kind of damage this new deal is going to have on them. We don't also have any detail on pricing or who the initial buyer was. That's probably all going to come out in the wash in the next sort of 10 days or so. But it's the farmers' agreement and they have to live with it. Raman?
Indeed. Daniel, let's lock in some details here. When exactly will this AGOA eligibility review be formally ended?
Well, the US Trade Representative, Michael Froman, has told us in a phone call yesterday that essentially the South Africans have now met all the benchmarks, including, as you say, this entry into the back of, the threat of being excluded from AGOA. They did the deal, and then they were a little bit concerned about some of the sanitary, some of the bureaucratic hurdles that they saw in place, and that they needed to resolve those to the satisfaction of the South Africans as well. And they've managed to do that. So I think these kind of trade negotiations, the sort of use of hardball tactics, is fairly normal. Let's also not forget that pork and beef are going to be rising product categories in South Africa going forward. Chicken is obviously the biggest prize, but pork and beef too are going to be allowed to be exported to South Africa. So that gives American farmers some more opportunities in the future, although at the moment the levels are likely to be fairly low.
Right, we'll leave it there for the time being. Thank you both gentlemen for your input. Daniel Rangers live in Washington, and of course Angela Kubler in Johannesburg as well.
South Africa's decision to restrict certain U.S. chicken imports marked a turning point in the country's agricultural trade policy and sent a clear message to global exporters. Domestic food security and local farmer protection now come first. For years, frozen bone-in chicken portions imported from the United States had flooded the South African market at prices local producers argued were unsustainable. As import volumes rose, pressure mounted on policymakers to act, setting the stage for one of the most consequential poultry trade disputes in recent African economic history. The roots of the conflict trace back to long-standing allegations of dumping. South African poultry producers accused U.S. exporters of selling chicken portions, particularly leg quarters, at artificially low prices that undercut local production costs. These claims were formally investigated by South Africa's International Trade Administration Commission, which examined pricing data, production costs, and market impacts. After multiple reviews, safeguard measures and anti-dumping duties were imposed on specific categories of U.S. poultry products. These actions were not sudden bans but calculated regulatory moves aligned with World Trade Organization mechanisms that allow countries to protect local industries from unfair trade practices. South Africa argued that without intervention, domestic poultry farms employing tens of thousands of workers would face collapse. The poultry sector is one of the country's largest agricultural employers, and its survival is closely tied to food affordability and rural livelihoods. For U.S. poultry exporters, South Africa had long been one of the most valuable overseas markets. American producers export parts of the chicken that are less popular domestically but in high demand abroad. South Africa became a major destination for these exports, benefiting U.S. processors while keeping prices low for South African consumers. When restrictions tightened, American exporters were forced to redirect shipments, renegotiate trade terms, or absorb losses. The dispute quickly escalated beyond economics into diplomacy. U.S. trade officials raised concerns, arguing that South Africa's measures were overly restrictive and harmed American agricultural interests. Negotiations followed, leading to partial market reopenings for certain U.S. poultry products under quota systems. However, these agreements did not fully restore previous access levels, leaving U.S. exporters operating under tighter limits and higher compliance costs. Inside South Africa, the reaction was markedly different. Local poultry farmers welcomed the protections as overdue. Many had struggled to compete against low-priced imports that squeezed profit margins and threatened farm closures. With import pressure reduced, domestic producers gained room to stabilize prices, reinvest in operations, and expand capacity. Feed suppliers, transport companies, and rural communities tied to poultry farming also benefited from the renewed market balance. The policy shift aligned with the broader trend across Africa toward agricultural self-reliance. Governments across the continent are reassessing food import dependence, especially after global supply chain disruptions exposed vulnerabilities in international trade. South Africa's poultry decision became a case study in how emerging economies can use trade remedies to protect strategic industries while remaining within international trade rules. From a consumer perspective, the issue was complex. Imported U.S. chicken had long provided an affordable protein source for low-income households. Policymakers faced the challenge of balancing farmer protection with food affordability. To address this, South Africa encouraged local producers to increase output and improve efficiency, aiming to prevent sharp price increases while reducing reliance on imports. As domestic production expanded, South African poultry companies invested in modern processing facilities, biosecurity improvements, and supply chain efficiencies. These investments strengthened the industry's resilience and reduced exposure to future trade shocks. Over time, local brands gained greater shelf presence, and consumer awareness of domestically produced chicken increased. For the United States, the dispute highlighted the risks of over-reliance on specific export markets. American poultry producers began diversifying destinations, increasing shipments to Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. However, replacing a market as large and established as South Africa proved challenging. The episode sparked broader discussions within U.S. agricultural circles about trade diversification and the long-term sustainability of export strategies. The global poultry market also took note. Other countries observed South Africa's approach closely, recognizing that trade remedies could be applied without triggering immediate retaliation if handled through formal channels. This raised concerns among exporters about the possibility of similar actions elsewhere, especially as nations prioritize domestic industries amid global economic uncertainty. Diplomatically, the issue underscored shifting power dynamics between developed and emerging economies. South Africa demonstrated that it was willing to assert its trade interests even when facing pressure from a major economic power. This stance resonated across Africa, reinforcing a growing confidence among governments to negotiate from positions of strength rather than deference. The poultry dispute also intersected with larger conversations about food sovereignty. South African officials emphasized that protecting domestic agriculture was not about isolationism but resilience. By maintaining a strong local poultry sector, the country could better withstand global price volatility, shipping disruptions, and geopolitical tensions that affect food supply. Over time, the restrictions contributed to a rebalancing of the market. While U.S. chicken did not disappear entirely, its role diminished, allowing local producers to regain market share. This shift altered supply chains, investment patterns, and pricing dynamics across the sector. The outcome illustrated how targeted trade measures can reshape industries without completely severing international ties. For American farmers and processors, the lesson was sobering. Access to foreign markets cannot be taken for granted, and domestic trade policies in importing countries can change rapidly in response to political, economic, or social pressures. The South Africa case became a reference point in U.S. trade policy discussions, emphasizing the need for engagement, compliance, and adaptability. As the dust settled, South Africa's poultry industry emerged more robust, while U.S. exporters recalibrated strategies. The episode did not end U.S.-South Africa trade relations but redefined them, placing greater emphasis on negotiation, mutual benefit, and respect for domestic priorities. It also reinforced the reality that global trade is increasingly shaped by local interests rather than purely by market forces. The story continues to evolve as both sides explore new agreements and adjustments. What remains clear is that South Africa's decision marked a significant assertion of economic agency. In choosing to protect its farmers, the country reshaped its poultry market and sent a signal felt far beyond its borders. The global agricultural landscape is changing, and this dispute stands as a vivid example of how emerging economies are rewriting the rules of engagement.
You've been watching Echoes of Africa, where every story carries the sound of tomorrow. If this moved you, subscribe now, like, and share so Africa's voice never fades into silence.